Hello everyone, and welcome back to a brand new video on the channel. Today we'll be covering interesting Mulgrave and South Johnstone Mill 610mm or 2-foot gauge railway operations around the Cairns region in the Australian state of Queensland during late 2024, where rather strangely for about 2 weeks Mulgrave Mill trains were still hauling sugarcane despite the mill having stopped crushing for the season. This was due to the fact that sugarcane was still being crushed in the northern area of the Mulgrave Mill network around Redlynch, undergoing its first year of road-to-rail operation since a bridge collapse the previous year, and sugarcane was still being trucked down from the now closed Mossman mill network. It would have been inefficient for Mulgrave Mill to keep running just for these batches of cane, so MSF Sugar, who own both the Mulgrave and South Johnstone Mill railway networks, organised an operation where instead it would be South Johnstone Mill that would assist Mulgrave with finishing off its cane crushing duties, as South Johnstone still had much of their own cane to crush before they could wrap up their own season, and were therefore able to do this for Mulgrave. This led to the very rare sight of South Johnstone Mill locomotives operating further north on the Mulgrave Mill network, and fulls being taken away south of Mulgrave and empties northwards, where otherwise it would be the other way around. Combined, the Mulgrave and South Johnstone Mill railway networks are 500 kilometres in length, and it's about 70 kilometres from Mulgrave to South Johnstone by rail, which is a big ask for these sort of locomotives, and would stretch both mills' resources thin if trains went the entire way. So, Mulgrave and South Johnstone trains would be swapping the bins in the midpoint at Babinda, which is the southern end of the Mulgrave network and the northern end of the South Johnstone network, and we will primarily be seeing the Mulgrave side of activity with a little bit of South Johnstone Mill operations around Babinda, usually done by Mulgrave. Without further ado, let's begin. Welcome to the Cairns Railfan. The first part of these operations that we get to see is the Redlynch sugarcane being transported south to Mulgrave Mill through the suburbs of Cairns, which is one of Mulgrave's most interesting lines due to the fact that no sugarcane surrounds it, with 610mm gauge operations being a strange sight in modern day suburbs. It's roughly 20 kilometres in length, where the suburban areas begin in Mount Peter and last up to Redlynch, where a small depot is. The line exists due to the fact many of these suburbs were once used for cane farming under Hambledon Mill, which closed in 1991, with the rapid urban development surrounding this line being one of the main reasons of closure. Today, cane fields still exist around and north of Redlynch, and the line only exists to serve as a rail link to these cane farms. Leading the train today is Locomotive Gordonvale, which is most often the unit operating the trains between Gordonvale and Redlynch. It was built in 1968 as DH13 of the 1067mm or 3-foot 6-inch gauge Queensland Government Railways DH class units. These QGR shunters were mostly retired in the 1990s and sold off to many sugarcane railways in Queensland and gauge converted, with Gordonvale being no different and being converted for Mulgrave in 1995 by the Bundaberg Foundry. On the rear of the train is E.M. Baldwin and Sons DB12 BV13, which is a 6-wheeled brake wagon controlled from the crew of the leading unit. Cane bins have no brakes on them, and so on journeys with difficult gradients, brake wagons are usually put on the front or rear of a train to assist with braking, sanding, and as a safeguard against runaways in case of a coupler snap, with the difficult part of the suburban run being mainly the gradients around Brinsmead just south of Redlynch. The brake wagon on this train was built in 1977 and was originally used by Hambledon Mill numbered as 3 until the mill's closure in 1991. We now emerge out of the suburbs and into the rural areas around Mount Peter as the train continues towards the mill. Just about to pull into the mill yard, the train stops for a shunting manoeuvre, where Gordonvale fetches the brake wagon off the rear to park it up in the shed sidings. With Gordonvale temporarily in the shed sidings, this gives the opportunity for E.M. Baldwin and Sons DH1811 Maitland to reverse out with 8 loaded 6-ton cane bins to attach to a larger rake being kept in the mill yard for later transfer south. These would have been loaded at the nearby concrete loading pad for Mossman sugarcane coming in south by road, haphazardly constructed just before the season began. We will see more of this later on. Next comes Commonwealth Engineering AD 17 Deerall. It'll be waiting just nearby on an adjacent line for Gordonvale to pull the rake of 36 Redlynch fulls forwards, so that it can attach to the rear of the train and take it south for storage at Banner Loop in Alumba. With Banner Loop just being around the corner, 17 Deer Owl will soon be on the way. This locomotive was built in 1961 as South Johnstone Mill No. 1. It was later renumbered to 21 in 2001, and Mulgrave received the locomotive in the early 2010s, and it was rebuilt in the years following. "17 Deer Owl now stores the bins into Banner Loop, where they will later be picked up by a larger locomotive to transfer with South Johnstone locos around Babinda. After shunting, 17 Deer Owl will return to the mill yard. Here we are at Mulgrave Mill 2 days later, this time at the Gordon Street end of the mill yard, where just across the road from the shed sidings is the location where Mossman cane is dropped off by truck for a front end loader to fill into Mulgrave bins. 11 Maitland has been the go-to locomotive for almost the entire season on these back and forth bin shunting duties, taking fulls into the mill yard and empties into the loading area. 11 Maitland was first built in 1972 as Hambledon Mill 1 until that mill's closure in 1991, where afterwards it fell under the ownership of Mulgrave and has since been heavily modified from its original appearance. while 11 Maitland was shunting together some new empties to replace the full rake that just went into the mill yard, one of the Mossman sugarcane trucks arrived for unloading, and as you can see, it's a matter of simply just dumping it on the ground for the front end loader to later deal with.
They've got 4 boilers here, not one boiler, they're going to make one big boiler. But I reckon a couple more years, just trying to dump it up and fix up the business down there. Where they're losing another ground. They're not going to make it. Johnson know they're going to be changed. The Johnson expansion down south more, that's the problem. Tree farmers gone into trees, so they lost a lot of cane. Now they're done with trees, they're growing cane again. No, bananas starting to fade away too. It's only a carrier. It's a good job.
Another truck had arrived and was unloading cane, with the front end loader getting back to work with the cane loading. We now find ourselves roughly 35 kilometers south of Gordonvale and on the outskirts of Babinda, where I came across 22 Alumba heading northwards with 74 6-ton Redlynch empties that were unloaded at South Johnstone and now being moved back up to Mulgrave, with the sight of a full rake of Redlynch bins being this long and this far south of the mill being a strange sight indeed. The locomotive hauling this train, 22 Alumba, has had a very strange and troubled history over the years. The locomotive was built by Prof Engineering in Zimbabwe, Africa, under contract from IMCO for South Johnstone Mill in 1990, where it eventually became 13 nyliter. It used an experimental hydrostatic transmission which theoretically was more efficient than a torque converter, and IMCO had found success in it with underground diesels used in Tasmania. However, the locomotive had many manufacturing defects, and before it could even get out of the mill yard, it suffered multiple breakdown-related incidents. At the end of its first season, it was already sent back to IMCO for urgent attention. It was then trialled around Mackay on the Farley Mill network, and was back at South Johnstone Mill by 1992. However, issues with the hydrostatic transmission saw it be rebuilt at South Johnstone during 1993 with a torque converter. By 2001, the locomotive was renumbered to 33 nyliter, and many years later, during 2009, the locomotive suffered a bad mechanical breakdown of some kind. It was out of service until it was sent to Mulgrave in 2011 with a new number and name, and it was eventually rebuilt to how it looks now in 2015. Nowadays, it seems to do the job, albeit suffering occasional mechanical defects, and it is often looked down upon for its strange appearance. Here we are at Moller's Loop in the south of Aloomba, where in a stroke of luck I found the Mulgrave track maintenance crew taking a break as they waited for 22 Aloomba to pass through. They had Commonwealth Engineering AA5 parked up with 3 ballast hoppers. Number 5 is the only Mulgrave Mill locomotive still in near original condition, with this locomotive clearly showing its age, having been built in 1955, still with its manual diesel mechanical transmission. It still wears the Mulgrave Mill livery of the mid-1990s to late 2000s, with green and yellow separated by a red stripe, and many of the small Mulgrave locomotives you see would have looked like this before their rebuilds. Behind me was also a Plaza Australia KMX 12T, built in 1997 for track tamping on the Mulgrave Mill network. Just further northwards, 22 Aloomba has been instructed to come to a stop in Mirrawal Loop to allow a southbound train of 82 loaded 6-ton cane bins with both Redlynch and Mossman cane to pass through. This train will be hauled by Gordon Vale's twin loco and Mulgrave Mill's second ex-Queensland Rail DH class named Mulgrave. As it passes, we'll be chasing it south to Babinda. In Queensland Government Railway service, Mulgrave was DH31, built in 1969 and was purchased and gauge converted at the same time that Gordonvale was in the mid-1990s. This year, in 2025, this locomotive has since been taken out of service for an overhaul. I was waiting at the Frenchman Creek area as I was expecting Mulgrave to be taking the rake of full cane bins all the way into Babinda, when all of a sudden I was completely taken by surprise when a South Johnstone Mill locomotive was heading northwards through Mulgrave Mill territory in reverse, travelling light engine to fetch the full cane bins that Mulgrave was bringing southwards. I had no clue it was coming around the corner behind me, so I couldn't even film it in time. But here it comes once again, having picked up the fulls that were needing to be brought to South Johnstone Mill for crushing. The locomotive hauling the train is E.M. Baldwin & Sons DH24B26, built in 1977, originally just numbered 6, but renumbered in 2001. Mulgrave Mill rebuilt the locomotive for South Johnstone in 2015. The next day I was headed down to Babinda once again, where on the way I caught Mulgrave heading northwards through Aloomba, headed to Mulgrave Mill with 110 empty 6-ton cane bins. Now down in Babinda, a South Johnstone Mill train has pulled over and stopped in Fenwich's Loop to allow 22 Alumba to continue northwards with 96 empty 6-ton cane bins. Afterwards, I decided to chase the South Johnstone Mill train that had continued south after 22 Alumba had passed through. This was a train of 36 loaded 6-ton cane bins being led by Commonwealth Engineering AD4 and Commonwealth Engineering AH5. A difference from South Johnstone to Mulgrave operations is that SJ constantly runs double headers with their small locomotives, whereas Mulgrave almost never does this. It wasn't too long until the same locomotives were returning through the area with 60 empty 6-ton cane bins. What we see here is still on the Mulgrave Mill network. There is a corner just down the road where the track becomes a part of the South Johnstone Mill territory, with a sign stating to change radio channel from Mulgrave Traffic Control to South Johnstone Traffic Control. The reason these locomotives are back with empties so soon is due to SJ's vast ground that they need to cover. They often have locomotives assigned and stationed to specific regions to shunt and perform duties in the surrounding area, where other locos will come from the mill itself and drop off empties for the shunters to place around the area. This also works the other way round, with the shunters dropping off fulls for other locos to come up and bring back to South Johnstone Mill, which is what this pair would have just done. The train has now slowed down for what is called a diamond crossing. These are unique rail-on-rail crossings that are prevalent on sugarcane railway networks in Queensland, where often cane trains need to cross the larger 1067mm or 3 foot and 6 inch gauge Queensland rail track to get to other areas. They do this with two-man crews, with the driver assistant getting out and holding down a switch or lever of some variety to align the rails for crossing the QR track. This, either by cabling or electronic means, will set nearby QR signals to display a stop aspect. If the lever is not held down, it will be impossible for the sugarcane train to cross, as by default the nearby rails are disconnected from each other. So if a cane train would approach the diamond crossing, it would be derailed as a safeguard to prevent train-on-train crashes in the case a cane train doesn't stop to change nearby QR signal displays to red. The last part of this video will see the train heading southwards through the main township of Babinda to get to the cane fields where the empties are required. This is quite significant, as over a decade ago, the background of this clip would have had the busy Babinda sugar mill operating nearby. The locomotives hauling this train were actually first built as Babinda mill locomotives. Number 5 was built in 1962 and number 4 was built in 1960. Both have kept their numbers throughout their service life. However, ever since Babinda Mill closed in 2011 due to financial problems, after transfer to South Johnstone Mill, their former nameplates used at Babinda Mill were later removed. These locomotives were once called Brampston and Harvey respectively, and here they are once again travelling through what would have once been their hometown. And with that, that's it for the video. If you've watched the whole thing, thank you so much, as it's by far one of the longest videos I've put together due to how extensive these operations were in late 2024. They were incredibly interesting to see take place, and for sure not something that happens often, so I was very lucky to be able to get all this footage. I would like to say thank you very much for 800 subscribers as well, and I am very grateful for how the previous video I made on Mossman Mill performed, considering all the time and effort that was put into it, alongside the fact that now a lot more people will know about what unfortunately became of such a fascinating sugar mill railway network. The next video on the channel should be covering some Queensland rail operations regarding the rather lackluster 100th anniversary celebrations of the North Coast Line in December 2024, alongside some general Cairns Scenic Railway movements around Cairns. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.